everyone, in today's tutorial I'll be going over some tips to model food in Houdini. We'll go over some vecs that you'll find useful, some modeling and coloring tips, and in the end we will have made a candy cane, a dinner bread roll, and a block of cheese. So let's get started. Okay, so let's start with the candy cane. I'm going to go over some of the things I did for my setup, and then we can kind of see how we accomplished the candy cane. And to start, I'm just going to put down a tube. These are the settings for the height and the rows. Doesn't really matter. You just need something for a starting point. Then I'm setting this attribute wrangle. I'm going to explain what this attribute wrangle is doing. The attribute wrangle is creating a list of points. And then I'm creating another vector, which is named sum. The initial vector, which is named sum, has no value, so I've set it to 0, 0, 0. And then I'm saying for each point that is contained in the list of PTS, I want to find the position. So the for each runs over every single point that is contained within that list and stores the position for that. Then I'm creating another vector that says center, and I'm taking the sum of the position and dividing it by the total number of points that are contained within the list. Essentially, this center vector is the center position of the primitive. So it's containing vector with x, y, and z coordinates. And then I'm storing the value of the center.y. So that would be the vector, that would be the float attribute contained within the vector along the y-axis. So center.y is the y component of that center position for each of the primitives. You need to know where each primitive sits vertically. So you find all the points that make up each primitive, and then you average their positions to get the center, and then you store the height, that is the y value, and this gives every primitive a single number representing how high up am I. So after doing that, I need to know where exactly the highest and the lowest part of my geometry is. So I'm going to put an attribute promote, and I want to store it on the detail, and I'm setting the promotion method to minimum. If I just change this to technical here, so we can take a look at the spreadsheet and just not get confused. So if we look at this, the detail is just taking the lowest position of the primitive that we have already calculated before. And this instead is promoting to the maximum. So that's telling us the highest part, the highest position of that primitive. And then we want to feed it into another attribute wrangle. So we're taking the first input is from our initial attribute wrangle. The one input is for the minimum, and the second or third input is for the maximum. Here we're storing the center y min in min y, and the highest point, which is the center y max, in max y. Then we're getting our actual number of rows. So if we go to the beginning, we see that we have 48 rows. So it's going to start from 0 and count all the way to 47. So 0 to 47 will give you 48 rows. And that's the exact number of primitive rows in this geometry that I have. This will vary for you. Next, I need to get the spacing between each of those. The math goes like this. Max y minus min y. That is the total vertical height of my geometry. So if my geometry starts from 5 is the highest, and it goes to -5, which is the lowest. Next, I want to divide it by the number of rows -1. The reason for the -1 is because if I had 10 fence posts, the space between all of those would be 9. It wouldn't be 10, because if it's 10, then I'm going to have to put an extra post, and then that will give me 11 posts. So I'm saying number of rows -1. I add the float here, so if it's an integer, it can change it to float, and it will be easy to divide it because it will be able to give me a remainder. You have to remember that integers are like 1, 2, but a float is 2.0, or it could be 2.5, and so that makes it easier to divide. Then I'm setting max, which is a safety check to prevent dividing by 0. So if, for example, the number of rows was 1 or 0, then it would use 1 instead. So that just ensures that everything works. And then I'm storing this spacing in the float attribute row underscore spacing, and I'm storing min y in the float attribute min underscore y. So everything we've done thus far and the storing of these attributes are the measuring tape of values that we're going to use to assign our row numbers. So we have another attribute wrangle that we're putting here, and we're taking the initial attribute wrangle and putting that in the first input, and this one is going into our second input. So basically, we want to read everything that we brought in from here. We ran this on detail, so we're bringing this from detail attributes, and we're storing them in float spacing and float min y. So now we need to compute the primitive center. In order to do that, we have to recalculate the center positions again. And so we're going vector center and we're putting the points list, and then we're running that over every single time. Once we get those center positions, then we want to divide it once again by the total number of points that are contained within that list. So now we need to determine what row number we're going to get from the bottom up. So that is going to be an integer. And so we're going to say integer. We're adding floor for a proper rounding up. And we want to say that center position y minus the lowest possible point of our primitive. And so that would tell us if this is our row 7 or so, it would determine that by taking the position here and subtracting it from here. And so that would then give us 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth. So the reason why we're doing center.y minus min.y is we need to subtract the center position from the lowest possible point of our primitive because we're calculating from the bottom up. So that would tell us what is the distance of that primitive from the bottom. And then we're dividing it by the spacing. And the reason we're dividing it by the spacing is to determine how many rows up exactly is this primitive. So if the distance from the bottom is 10 and each row spacing is 2.17 units, then we're going to get 4.6 rows up. And then, of course, finally, we are adding 0.5, which is basically just to give us a proper rounding up. And then we store that within an attribute that's called row. And so doing that, we're then able to assign rows to our primitive here. So I've added a sort just to make sure that everything is going directly from 0 all the way to the top. So after our sort node, we have another primitive wrangle. So this primitive wrangle is saying if I at row, and then we have the modulo operator, which gives you the remainder after the division. So if that is equal to 1, then I want to set a prim group that is called odd rows. Basically, it says, for instance, row 0 divided by 2, that would be 0. So that's an even row. Row 1 divided by 2, that's 1, so that's an odd row. Row 3 divided by 2, remainder 1, that's an odd row, and so on and so forth. So once we do that, then we can put this into our color attribute. And then we can now say on every odd row, I want this to be red. And so that's how we're able to get a red color on each row. So all we need to do then is just to bend this, set your capture length, and then how far you want to bend it. I've moved it up, I've done a polyfill, and then I promoted that to the attribute color to the point. Now it did give me this very blurred red to white, which is not exactly what I wanted, but that was a problem for when I finished, so I just saved that. And then when I eventually was preparing this tutorial, I added some candy canes, and I just kind of I added some candy canes over here. I did a small simulation here just to make them fall nicely over this particular display situation here. And then I'm assigning my color again. Oh, okay. So I'm assigning my color again, and it's on primitive, so it's fine. But I know once I promote it to the points, then it's just going to gonna give me that blurred effect, which I don't want. I found that if you add this facet node and you say unique points, and then you have your attribute promote to color, it kind of preserves that blocky primitive look that I want, and not the blurred point attribute, not the blurred point color that I would get. So that's basically how you do a candy cane. So the next food item we're making is cheese. We're starting with a circle and we're setting the arc angle to 45, and it's an open arc. I'm converting that to a line, and then I'm adding an add node, and I'm saying delete geometry but keep the points. Then I add another point at the center. This is the origin point. That's number 13. Then I put down another add node, and this add node is set to by pattern on polygons, and its point is, the point of this add node is basically to connect all these points together. So I'm saying how exactly I want it to be connected, and I'm saying from 13, I want you to connect to 0, connect all the way through here, and then from 12, go back to 13. So basically that's what gives us this exact shape. Then I'm doing resampling just to add more points to it, because I'm going to extrude this. So I'm doing a polyfill, convert that to a single face polygon, I'm reversing it, and then I'm doing a poly extrude. The cheese slice is basically almost done at this point. Next, I'm doing a VDB from polygons, and I want to do a SDF subtract. In order to do this, I'm basically going to use another VDB, which is created from spheres. So I'm subdividing this, I'm scattering some points all across this, and then I'm adjusting the piece scale and putting a copy to point. So that gives us this. Then this is converted to VDB from polygons, and then I'm doing a subtract. So basically the cheese is almost done. But if you take a look at any block of cheese, and if you want to make something look more organic, you just have to add noise. That's how I made my cookie, that's how I made my bread, and that's how we're going to make this cheese. And this is just a very simple volume VOP that I'm creating. It just makes it look a bit more organic when everything isn't uniform. So if we compare this to this, like even the edges here, they just look a bit better because they're not direct cut and straight. And I could have done something like making maybe this mountain. I could have distorted this using like a mountain node, but adding a volume VOP is just another simple way to do it. So if we dive in, it's the basic procedure for adding noise to your geometry in VDB. You just take your initial position, you plug that into a noise, and then you add it. Now, I like to use this unified noise static anytime I'm doing VDBs, because it gives me a very interesting noise, and it just looks a bit better than turbulent noise to me. So then I'm fitting those values into exactly what I want. And then I'm adding that to my density, and then that's just what goes out. So that just gives me this nice noise. So basically that's the cheese done. I add a VDB smooth, and I'm converting that back into polygons. And just something to bear in mind anytime you're doing food, it helps to have some extra attributes. So you can get some extra attributes using the measure node, and basically what you might want to calculate could be like some extreme areas by the edges. Maybe you want to calculate how curved something is. And when I took a look at the block of cheese, I could see like by these edges, maybe they were a bit lighter. Maybe a little bit of light could pass through these edges more. And so that will be very useful when you're doing some subsurface scattering or something like that. So I added curvature and another one called details. And just remember to do like an attribute remap, because it would be best if you keep the values between 0 and 1. So if, for instance, you've added this curvature here, and let's take a look on primitives. Yep. and maybe, oh, it actually goes from 0 to 2. So all of these might not appear correctly when you take it to the stage to use that attribute. So sometimes better to just remap it to 0 to 1 so you know exactly what you're getting. And also it could be useful, for instance, if you're doing some roughness and you want like extra shine at the edges and you want the rest to be a bit rougher. And the roughness is basically a float. It's 0 to 1, 0 being very shiny and 1 being rough. So it will be very helpful if you just remap it to 0 to 1. And basically that is the cheese. All right, so let's go to the last one, which is the bread dinner roll. This is similar to the cookie tutorial that I had last year or 2 years ago now. And what you want to do is just to start off with a very simple shape like a box. You kind of want to think, how would what polygon does this food look the most similar to? And so I felt that would be a box. And we're just going to edit the top, kind of move it like that. Doesn't have to be perfect because we're going to smooth it out, which will give us this very nice dinner roll shape. And when we subdivide it, those edges disappear even more. Okay, the next thing I want to do is to kind of cut a dent within that dinner roll. And so I've placed this mountainous spheres, and I've done a Boolean cut and just kind of sliced those out. Okay, the next thing I need to do is to ensure that I can get these groups and use them further down the line. So in the Boolean, don't forget to output this primitive group called A outside B. Next, I want to promote that group to points, and then it just gives us like this very nice cut edge. The only thing is I don't want what I want to use this for. I don't want it to be directly just like on the edge of where I've cut it, because I feel it's not going to look very realistic. So I'm doing a group expand, which is it gives us like some extra points just here and there, and so it won't be like too well cut and can look a bit more organic. The next thing I want to do is to assign a group, and if we just take a look here, so it's basically saying if that point is not within A outside B, then I want to assign it an attribute that is I at bread dent is equal to 1. So if the group is not in A outside B, then I want the integer attribute to be 1. I'm doing a little bit of transform. That's just because the smaller geometry you have, the more difficult it might be to do like a VDB from polygon noise, because it actually does it based on like the scale of the geometry. So I'm making a VDB from polygons, and I'm ensuring that I bring in my attribute called bread dent, and I'm storing it within this VDB, which is basically the kind of voxels that you see here. And then I'm doing a volume VOP. So let's dive in. Okay, so this volume VOP is very simple, and all it's doing is creating a noise for most of this dinner roll and creating a different type of noise for the inside of that bread dent. This unified noise static, I'm fitting this, and that is actually the noise that's driving most of the bread dinner roll. This down here is what is driving the noise within the bread dent. So what have I done? I've made 2 turbulent noises, which I'm adding. They're what's giving me like that noise, and then I'm putting another turbulent noise node, but this one has no amplitude and no roughness. I can't remember exactly why, but I know if I plug this P into the mix it doesn't work, but I can't remember exactly why it doesn't work. So this is kind of how I just use it to bring like the original without any noise in, and I want to mix the original without any noise with the noise here. So I'm putting it in a mix node, and then I'm bringing in a bind, and I'm saying a bind import, and I'm saying bring in the attribute breadDent, which is an integer. And so that's what I plug into my bias. So using this, if I just do this, we kind of see like, oh, it's giving us the noise on only the breadDent. Obviously doesn't look right because, we're just doing part of the geometry. So that's what I want to add to my initial position. Okay, so this will actually show us better. So I'm adding this to my initial density. And so what we see is we have the noise for the breadDent and there's no noise on the rest of the dinner roll. That noise for the dinner roll is contained here, which is what I'm then adding to this and then plugging that finally into the output. So that's what gives us this, which I can now smooth. And so we can see the noise here just looks a bit more dinner roll type of noise. And then I'm converting that into a polygon. Finally, I'm bringing this here because I need this breadDent attribute and A outside B for shading. So I want to do a group transfer and I'm taking that initial group from here and I'm putting it on my VDB. I also want to expand it a bit just so it can like move closer to the edge, because if we just look at it here, like this part doesn't look nice. It looks very blocky. But by the time I do a group expand, then we see, oh, it looks a bit more organic. It's not like just blocky. And I want to put into my attribute wrangle once again, like put that into breadDent. Then I'm doing an attribute remap. The reason I'm doing that is because I wanted to assign a color and then I wanted to do an attribute blur, which will kind of give me like a well blended edge between what is not within the dent and what is in the dent. And so now this is what I'm going to use for my shading. I'm just moving through some of these nodes, like I'm not explaining, I'm putting a match size because I don't know, I feel like you would know that. And basically I'm adding a bit more blur to the dent. I'm adding some other attributes like curvature, and I'm also adding another attribute here, which is curve. Now let's take a look at this one. So the curve is just calculating like some extra bits of curvature, and I noticed I had more within the dent, but there's still some like outside on the general dinner roll, and I'm keeping those because it would help if I have like a central color and then I can use like another color and put it in the areas where it's not purple right now. So it would make the bread dinner roll look a bit more interesting. And then I want to put this into an attribute VOP that's going to give me some color. This I learned from someone online, which I believe a lot of you know, Rohan Davi. And basically what he did is to bring the curvature. I want to fit that and I want to have a color mix. This color mix, I'm promoting the primary color, and that's what's going to give us this. So this is the original color, but I want to add some more color to it. And how I'm going to do that is to take the relative bounding box of the first input and then convert that to float. And the reason is because I want to take this second float value here, which is the y. This represents x, y, z. So we're then pointing that into the add, and I want to take some noise and point that into my add. The next thing I want to do is also add the curve attribute which I just showed you, and I want to multiply these two together and feed that into a ramp that is going to be a color. So I'm multiplying these two together and bringing them out. This is that ramp that we just saw. So it's going to give us a variation in color, and that's kind of what gives us this. So because this is taking us like from Y, the lowest point is going to have this color, and then the highest point is going to have this color. And wherever there's like any noise for the curve U, that's where we're kind of going to see like these nice flecks of different color come through. Now, the issue is I do have these bread dents and they have a different color to the rest of the dinner roll. Most of the time, like the bread is baked together in like grid of, let's say, 9. So this is kind of what you get when you cut them out. So if you do that, then this part is not going to get toasted. So I need another color. And the way I'm going to do that is to kind of make another color with an attribute VOP and blend the two together. So I'm duplicating this attribute VOP and I'm assigning another color that I kind of want to use for the inside of my bread. And then I'm feeding this into an attribute wrangle. And basically, what this attribute wrangle is doing is taking the color from input 1, input 2, and then it's making a bias based on the dent attribute. So if I go here, we can see we have f at dent, basically. So wherever is meant to be, wherever f at dent is where it's going to make a bias, and it's kind of going to assign this color here to that part. And so that kind of preserves the initial color we had and brings in this nice variation to the middle. So that's the bread model. And that's the end of the tutorial. I've included the project file in the description. Let me know what you think and what other tutorials you'd like to see.